Hello and welcome to Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimage. My name is Rob Buscher and I'm the film festival curator. And today I'm going to be giving a brief presentation about the American Peril Anti-Asian Racial Propaganda exhibition. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So those of you who are regular viewers of Tadaima probably know me more as a film curator, but one of the long-term projects that I've been involved in for the past 5 years or so is the collection of research and exhibition of anti-Asian racial propaganda. I talked a little bit about this in the Tadaima 2020 programs when we were discussing World War II anti-Japanese propaganda. But in light of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the conversations surrounding some of the parallels between anti-Japaneseness and anti-Muslim bigotry, we thought it was important to include a more in-depth discussion of this particular topic. So in addition to the work that I do as a film curator, I also lecture at the University of Pennsylvania Asian American Studies program, which is where most of this research has taken place. So we'll just jump right into it. And I like to start these kinds of conversations by defining my definition of propaganda, which is biased or one-sided information used to promote a political cause or specific point of view. So obviously, some types of propaganda are easier to define. When you think about World War II or any of the global conflicts in the early to mid 20th century, we get these pictures of war recruitment posters, posters that are vilifying the enemy, posters in the home front campaign, instructing people on how to conserve materials or food rationing, etc. But propaganda really can spread beyond that into a variety of other mediums, including spoken rhetoric within political speeches, of course, the written word in literature or journalism, all types of visual art beyond printed posters, as well as some of these other mediums that I've listed here. The propaganda that we'll be discussing, however, is largely printed materials, either on paper or cloth, fabric, other wearable materials. So in terms of the fundamental elements of propaganda, as I mentioned in my definition, it's one-sided or biased information. It tends to reinforce ideology that is central to various systems of control, whether it be political, religious, or class or race hierarchy, sometimes and most often a combination of all three of these. And also it tends to reduce very complex concepts into simple dichotomies. Very few things are clear cut as good and bad or black and white. And yet this is the way that thinking is reduced within the concept of propaganda. You're either with us or against us. There's no middle area. So in terms of the exhibit itself, there are several periods of interest that I've taken note of with regards to how Asian racial identity has been basically prescribed by mass media, popular culture, journalism, various political parties throughout the United States history. And although they may seem sort of disconnected based on the topics and the time periods, I've actually managed to find a number of through lines that we can actually see across all of these time periods. And the idea behind American Peril is to try and help people understand from a contemporary viewpoint that we didn't just arrive at anti-Asian racism. And keep in mind that this exhibit started, the research for it was in 2017. And we're only seeing the spike in anti-Asian hate crimes in 2020 and 2021. It doesn't mean that hate crimes weren't taking place in between, but the sense is that, you know, as our discourse emerges, shapes, and basically changes the ways in which Asian bodies and other non-white bodies are perceived by the majority white society, oftentimes newer immigrant populations or populations that have been historically marginalized become scapegoated for other society issues. Obviously, the pandemic is a great example of this, but things like joblessness and loss of wages during the Chinese exclusion era, issues related to territorial claims and the necessity to expand for resource acquisition in US imperialism in the Pacific and Hawaii and the Philippines. Obviously, the conflicts with Japan and the Pacific front of World War II, economic competition later in the 20th century with Japan again. And then certainly, although post 9/11 is when Islamophobia became more of a household topic, but the anti-Muslim bigotry is something that has also existed essentially throughout the entire history of the United States in different ways. But again, as we kind of go through some of the artifacts that are involved in this particular exhibit, I think you'll start to see some of these similarities that I've also drawn attention to. So when we look at the Victorian era Chinese immigration to the United States, it's obviously characterized by a power imbalance that is taking place in Asia. The European powers, as well as the United States, had been involved in various forms of extraterritoriality during the Opium Wars. And this has created sort of an imbalance where Chinese laborers are seeking to leave China in large numbers. This also coincides with the abolition of the African slave trade in the British Empire. So suddenly the practice of coolie laborers or indentured servants coming from both South Asia and China become very prominent, basically creating Asian people as a new human labor capital once African slave trade has been abolished. And we see some of this emerging in the United States. I think initially Chinese were welcomed as an inexpensive alternative to white Europeans. But as more of the European immigrants and European descendants who had been in the United States for several generations began moving west and joining the settlement efforts, they often found themselves at odds with the Chinese laborers who they perceived as the reason that they weren't getting the wages that they were demanding from their employers. And so as popular opinion built against the Chinese laborers, we start to see a number of different strategies to basically capitalize on this. And so I think one of the things that I find most interesting about this period are the Victorian era handbills or the trade cards that we're looking at here. These were actually given out on the street. They're roughly the size of a postcard. And in the 1870s, 1880s, when these were manufactured, most working class people didn't own art. And so the idea of being given a pretty picture of something or a picture in general meant that most people would hold on to that rather than throwing it away immediately if it was just the written advertisement. And so sometimes the products that were being sold had absolutely nothing to do with the pictures on the front. And we see this sort of oriental motifs, like on the right hand side, a young Chinese boy smoking opium, presumably. Although offensive, it's not necessarily on the same scale as the two celluloid cuff and collar ads that we see in the center and left. Essentially, the laundry industry had been capitalized on by Chinese laborers. Once they had been driven out of mining labor, they started the tertiary industries of restaurants and laundry. And as the anti-Chinese sentiments grew in the Intermountain region and the West Coast, there were many calls by working class party politicians, California Workingmen's Party, etc., who argued that the American people should stop doing business with the Chinese if they want them to be gone. And a lot of the motifs around not just celluloid cuff and collar, but other prominent laundry detergent, or in this case, starch for the cuff and collar, these would be used as an alternative to doing business with the Chinese. And that's essentially what these trade cards are telling within these images. By contrast, looking at how Native Hawaiians are being portrayed around this very same time, in the late monarchy period with Queen Luluokalani, we see an intentional association with both Blackness and indigeneity. And when you think about 1880s and even 1890s, this is less than 30 years after African American slavery was abolished, right? And after the Civil War. So what would it mean for a group of people to be associated with Blackness? And in the same token, there were US land wars being fought with Native Americans on nearly a constant basis throughout the 19th century. So consider again what it means for a population to be associated with indigeneity, as is being done in the image here on the right-hand side. In further afield in the Philippines, after the Spanish-American War results in a conclusive defeat of the Spanish Empire, the US moves very quickly to grab some of their territorial holdings, including the Philippines. At the time, they had actually communicated to the Filipino rebels that they would support independence if they fought alongside the Americans against the Spanish. And yet, once the Treaty of Versailles was signed, they continued to colonize the Philippines themselves. From an unlikely source comes another piece of propaganda. The British imperial author Rudyard Kipling, probably best known for the Jungle Book, he wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden that essentially implored the United States to join with Great Britain in taking up this burden of quote unquote civilizing the uncivilized world. And so, this is just one stanza from his poem. You can find the rest online if you're interested. So this came out in 1899, and almost immediately we see this huge deluge of anti-Black images that are being associated with now the Filipinos as well, and as well as this extremely sort of patriarchal, patronizing attitude towards the non-white peoples who are now colonial subjects of the United States. I think historically, in at least the US public schools, we've been taught to think of ourselves as a republic, but it's really very difficult to argue that the United States was not an empire currently, but even in this time period, especially as the US created these colonial holdings. But again, you can kind of see this intentional association between the Filipinos, particularly in the right-hand image. We see General Emilio Aguinaldo, the first president of the Philippines, who was at war with the United States, in the traditional pickaninny stereotype that associated with African-American children, and a quote taken from Uncle Tom's Cabin. So again, what is the purpose of associating the Filipinos with African Americans at this time period, if not to essentially discourage the American people from thinking of them as people with full rights? And so we see all sorts of offensive imagery within the popular press, particularly in political cartoons throughout the following decade. This particular image showing Uncle Sam and Lady Columbia, the personification of America, at the Thanksgiving dinner with their new faces, right? There's new colonies. But because all of their colonial subjects are being infantilized, it sort of diminishes the claims that they have on sovereignty and even their rights as human beings. And unfortunately, images like this become very prevalent in this time period, to the extent that we see on the far side of this a very extreme representation of this propaganda campaign to associate the Filipinos with indigeneity. The Igorot tribe, because there are dozens of different indigenous communities that have lived in the Philippines and currently live in the Philippines. Igorot were one of these tribes, and the United States sort of positioned them as a representative population of what the Philippines was. And so starting with the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, they created a 100-acre Igorot village where they imported the indigenous persons from the Philippines and essentially established a human zoo where people would come and watch them in their supposedly daily rituals. One of the most offensive aspects of this was that they were made to eat dog meat on a daily basis for the delight and horror of the fairgoers. Although this was a practice done for special ritual occasions on occasion in the Philippines, this would not be a regular thing that was done on a daily basis. And again, keeping the narrative firmly grounded in this idea that the Filipinos are not ready to rule themselves, and thus the United States is just in acquiring this territory and continuing to have dominion over the Philippines in this era. So moving ahead to the Japanese American community, obviously there's plenty of examples that we could talk about in the early 20th century as well, and a fair share of hate going around between the alien land laws in California and various attempts to discourage Japanese immigration. But we really see the peak of this at the beginning of World War II, in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor by Imperial Japan. This is two of the objects from the American Peril exhibit that I find most striking in terms of the side-by-side comparison. On the left-hand side, we have a Victorian era trade card from 1882 that shows the California Workingmen's Party labor leader, Dennis Kearney, and he's dragging a Chinese coolie through a laundry wringer by his queue braid. So 60 years later, and you can see the date here printed on this postcard, 1942, we see a postcard with General Hideki Tojo being drawn through a laundry wringer by an American soldier. How does an image like this live on in the public imagination for 60 years and basically transfer between Asian ethnic communities, if not for the kind of oral tradition and other popular cultural references that kind of continue this anti-Asian hatred, anti-Asian violence, and essentially pave the way for a whole variety of very violent images that we see throughout the wartime era. And it's fair to say that, of course, in times of war, all countries have propaganda. But when you compare the way that Japanese people are portrayed in World War II propaganda in the United States, comparative to the Italian fascists or the German Nazis, it's only the Japanese that are being reduced on racial levels to this caricature of a yellow person with buck teeth and bottle rim glasses. And there's a distinct level of violence that we see within these particular campaigns that are not actually shown in the same extent with these other wartime enemies. And so, I don't need to beleaguer this point, right? Like, I think the Japanese American community understands the impact that anti-Japanese propaganda has had on us over generations, but it is important to basically understand from this time period, how do we get to the 1970s, 80s, and 90s as Japan makes economic comeback with the help of the United States, the investment during the Korean War, as well as some very creative economic planning from Japan. By the early 70s, Japan was already leading export economy and doing business with the United States on a level that exceeded, I think, anyone's expectations. And in the US manufacturing industry was something that people viewed as a threat. Looking at how the language is shaped within the popular press, there's a intentional usage of militarized language. So in the Time magazine cover on the left-hand side, Japan's business invasion, right? And there are many articles a little bit later in the late 80s, early 90s, after Japanese business interests had purchased a couple of major US real estate holdings like Rockefeller Center, the controlling shares for Columbia Pictures, the Hollywood studio. We start to see American economists using the phrase economic Pearl Harbor. And I think that obviously conjures all sorts of images, as do these t-shirts that we see here. The center frame was created by auto workers union in Florida, basically imploring their fellow Americans to purchase American goods before it's too late, with this caricature of a Mitsubishi fighter plane dropping a payload of consumer electronics on the United States. Another t-shirt on the right-hand side basically shows the Enola Gay, the bomb that the plane that dropped the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, with an atomic bomb. And obviously you can read the rest for yourselves. So for this kind of language, this kind of sentiment, and these kinds of images to become popular, or perhaps remain popular up through the 1990s, it means that there's enough of this anti-Japanese sentiment that had remained from World War II for these emotional responses to kind of evoke these past memories and traumas of that wartime aggression against Japan. And I think, some of it may have been predicated on actual fear of people losing their jobs. The manufacturing industry certainly was in steep decline throughout this time period. But for the most part, it's factory owners and business owners using the Japanese as a scapegoat, once again, to sort of defray any criticism that they might be receiving for moving their manufacturing operations overseas and stopping to the employment of American workers. So we see, again, similar strategy perhaps in the first year of the pandemic, when the COVID-19 virus became known as China virus or Kung flu in certain conservative circles, clearly scapegoating overseas enemy, quote unquote, for the mismanagement by the United States administration at that time. So moving on to the last phase of the exhibit, I think for those of us who were old enough to remember 9/11 from the Japanese American community, whether you were alive in 1941 or not, there is a very deep level of empathy and also discomfort that this brought about in terms of the immediate anti-Muslim bigotry that we saw in almost every facet of society. And I think these side-by-side images are hopefully enough to remind those of you who might not have lived through this time period or might be too young to remember, that again, we've seen this happen with our own community, and this was something that was being done on a large scale to the Arab and Muslim American communities here in the United States. And just like anti-Japaneseness didn't come from Pearl Harbor alone, there has been a long history of anti-Muslim bigotry that we can see through various propaganda periods, starting certainly as early as the British Imperial propaganda, when most of Palestine was under the British Empire, but more contemporarily, after the Shah of Iran was deposed by Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolution takes place, there's this intense backlash towards Iran, certainly during the oil crisis, even before that, anti-Arab sentiments. throughout the 90s, certainly with the first Gulf War in Iraq. We see a lot of this kind of anti-Arab, if not anti-Muslim bigotry. But then certainly, post 9/11, I think is when we start to see a more intentional association of religion and vilifying Islam as, the cause of the violence that had been perpetrated in New York at 9/11. And I think it's kind of a dangerous precedent, as we saw with the anti-Japanese propaganda. We know how many innocent people suffered. And also this inability, I think, of the average American to discern between the actions of an overseas government or entity with that of the diasporic population who lives here in the United States. And unfortunately, we are the people who suffer the most when these kinds of incidents and actions happen. But that's just kind of a short collection of some of the objects and artifacts that we had. And I wanted to talk a little bit now about how we've presented them in the past and how we hope to continue presenting them in the future. So, as I mentioned, this project started about 5 years ago. In 2017, I was at an antique fair in Center City, Philadelphia, and I encountered a World War II anti-Japanese work poster. You can see it here in the right-hand picture. This was actually the first time that I had seen an anti-Japanese wartime poster in person. And you can't really make it out here, but it's got a flaming face of a Japanese soldier, and it says, "Factory fires help the Japs prevent fires." And it had like instructions of how, as a factory worker, you can practice fire safety. But for me, as a Japanese American, like, it was sort of a gut punch. It's this visceral reaction that I got from seeing this thing for the first time in person. And I've spent a good deal of my personal professional life devoted to studying and teaching about these topics. So I figured if that was the kind of impact that it had on me, and I'm fairly desensitized to this content, what would it be like for a 19-year-old college student to see something like this in the classroom? And so I bought the poster on the site, and basically my wife and I have been collecting ever since. And for the most part, I use these as teaching resources in the classes that I teach at University of Pennsylvania. And it was actually towards the end of 2017, maybe beginning of 2018, my wife had this incredible idea. Kathy Matos, she said, why don't you put together an exhibit? More people should see this. And especially at that time period, there was this conversation around alternative facts. And I figure if you can hold a physical object in your hands and know that this came from a certain time period, it's harder to argue that this is fake news, right? And so that was the motivation behind putting this together. We were lucky to partner with 12 Gates Arts, who is Pennsylvania's only Muslim South Asian owned art gallery in Old City, Philadelphia. And we ran the exhibit for the entire month of November 2018, coinciding with the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival that year. In total, we had somewhere around 1,000 people, I think, throughout the entire month. We hosted a couple conference presentations as part of a symposium around Asian American music and material culture. And then certainly we had a couple of curator talks and receptions to entice more people to see it. It was overwhelmingly received well. I think some people weren't really sure what the point was of putting artifacts like this on display. But I would say that the vast majority of people understood that what we were doing was from a place of education and, to kind of contest some of these attitudes that were dominant in the political discourse at that time period. So that was 2018. And we had the opportunity to do a second phase of the project in February and March of 2020, just before the pandemic began. And this time we were able to work with Philadelphia's City Hall to place artifacts in 6 exhibit cases, as you can see here. These are 2 of the 6 cases in the exhibit. And then we also had a line of portraits that we had shot of Philadelphia-based Asian American community members who have been impacted directly by some form of anti-Asian racism, and basically having them pose with these artifacts to humanize that experience and show people, you know, what the human face is of these anti-Asian propaganda campaigns kind of throughout history. For the photo session itself, we chose to focus specifically on Japanese Americans and the Muslim American community, in part because so much of the previous years had been focused on the rising anti-Muslim sentiments. We had seen some anti-Muslim hate crimes taking place in our region, as well as the Muslim travel ban that was enacted in the previous administration. So we felt that it was necessary to really focus and highlight the particular connection between Japanese Americans and Muslim and Arab Americans, which we did through this portrait series. And so I'll just show you a few of them. These were printed in large format, poster size, high art, high resolution. And you know, essentially the people are almost life size. So when you're walking down the hallway, you're kind of confronted by the gaze of each of these subjects. Here we have a married couple, Rieko, who is a Japanese immigrant, and Ali, who's Iranian American, and of course their biracial daughter, posing with 2 magazine covers from the 1930s. Ken magazine was a short-lived political magazine by the publishers of Esquire, showing these racialized caricatures and very unflattering depictions of the respective communities. These are separate portraits, but for the sake of time, I've combined them on the next few slides. We have a South Asian man, originally from Pakistan, posing with a terrorist body bag. This was sold as a novelty gift in the post 9/11 era. And on the right-hand side, we have Teresa, who's a Sansei, born in one of the sugar beet labor camps in Idaho during World War II, posing with a Life magazine that shows a Japanese soldier's skull on an Arizona war worker's desk. On the left-hand side here, we have a Sikh man who's posing with Frank Miller's Holy Terror comic, which caused a major stir when it was released. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it was actually blamed for a lot of anti-Asian attacks because, again, Sikh are not Muslim, right? But because of the turban, a lot of Sikh were targeted by hate crimes in this era. And so part of this is to tell that story that, you know, although we're talking anti-Muslim bigotry, there's a much larger group of people who are being caught up in this violence. On the right-hand side, we have a Shin Nisei Makoto, who's posing with the Tokyo Kid magazine cover, created by Disney illustrator Jack Campbell, a well-known series of anti-Japanese comics during World War II. And the final slide of portraits I wanted to show you, we have a Yemeni woman posing with a jihad chic, like a fake t-shirt of Vogue, obviously very deeply offensive. And on the right-hand side, Ed, who's a Sansei, born in Poston camp, wearing a 1980s protest hat, Buy America, right? And you see the flag of Japan crossed out. So this idea of wearable propaganda, something that people are being subjected to on the street. It's not just something that hangs in an office or in private, but this is some of the most nefarious kind of propaganda. As it continues, in some ways, as a utilitarian object, people may continue to wear these long past a conflict time period, and it continues to stir up these anti-Asian sentiments. So now that we're here in the pandemic and thinking about the impact of the work that we've been doing in the past few years, we're still trying to reach audiences. And I think now more than ever, it's important to think about the history of anti-Asian racism. Again, something like the Atlanta spa shootings doesn't just materialize from nowhere. This is based on hundreds of years of sexual commodification of Asian women, and the stereotypes that are attached to that through popular media and popular culture. So we talked a lot about that actually as part of a Zoom session that was held in May of this year. There is a recording available, and I'm going to share the link with you on the next screen. But we also have a partial listing of some of the key artifacts from the exhibit available on 12 Gates Art's website. So if you're interested in learning more about this history and about this exhibit, I encourage you to visit some of the links that I have here. The full portrait collection of about maybe 24 portraits are available on the photographer's website, Justin Chu, who did the tremendous work of portrait shoots. As I mentioned before, you can see more of the virtual exhibition of select artifacts at 12 Gates Art's website. And finally, if you're interested, you can watch our panel discussion on YouTube. So I know that this is a difficult subject. I appreciate you taking the time to learn about it today. And as we continue to understand our connectivity between Japanese Americans and other communities of color, I hope you will consider joining us for a live panel discussion that's going to be hosted on Friday, September 10th, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, where I will be joined by two of the portrait subjects from the American Peril Phase 2, Dr. Faria Khan and Dr. Ahmed Salim Tekelioglu, who have both done tremendous civil rights advocacy work in their respective communities, and we'll be kind of discussing the broad view of allyship between Japanese Americans and the Muslim and Arab American communities. So thanks again for joining us, and stay safe.